All right, Terry. Friend of mine wanted me to ask, when you did the training in Western North Carolina, did you find the terrain similar to what you would be operating in Laos and Cambodia?
Only when we did our final problem where we jumped in up in Pisgah or Yawari National Forest, the mountains. Because where I was in the Central Highlands, it was all mountains. So you didn't have, well, I mean, for the most part, it was all mountains. When we went into Laos, it was all mountains. Up one, down, up, down, up, down, and very steep, you know. Um, you didn't get the luxury of a lot of walking on flat ground because it was all really um, and since we don't have a way of showing pictures here, you can't really see my pictures of what the terrain actually looked like. But you've probably seen some of them on that one site. Um, um, Especially the pictures that I took from our radio relay site at Leghorn, because you can see for miles and you see all the mountains up and down.
Yeah, I'm actually about to pull up one of these photographs just for the viewers that are going to see this and all to get a visual here. But I mean, it's a pretty dang good
Okay,
depiction.
perfect. Yeah, you see that it's just, and it's kind of deceptive because it looks like almost in this picture that as you go away from my point of view, that you're going gradually uphill, but in fact, you can kind of see all the different uh, hills and ridges and of course between, yeah, okay, good. Now between those hills, you've got creeks that would run, and the water would run just like you would over here.
Well, I mean, I think it's important to visualize the terrain and understanding what kind of difficulties and the environment you're having to operate in. I mean, outside of the triple canopy um, forest jungle, you've also got, and these are steep
Yep.
inclines and declines that you're traversing. I mean, it's a miracle you didn't have any more broken legs or sprained ankles than in reality actually came out of the war.
But that was fairly common because if you most of our LZs where the choppers would try to put us in, the ideal situation would be that the chopper could actually land. But usually those were being watched by the NVA. And, after a while, they knew, okay, these guys are going to get put in on an old. Um, the Montagnards used to farm what they called slash and burn. So they'd maybe clear cut a hillside and they'd grow crops until the ground just no longer would support growing, and then they'd move on. So now you've got a field. It might be an acre, 2 acres in size. So you could land a couple of choppers at once. Um, but then the elephant grass would start growing, and that elephant grass could be as much as 10, 12 feet high. And looking in this picture, you don't see any clearings or anything that are, I think in the lower left corner, that's probably, now move over to your left. Now go down just a hair, right there, just a little more down, right there. It looks like that's probably the least dense area. At the very bottom, over towards the right, you can actually see right too far over. Now go down to the very bottom, a little more, right there. Now, as you go up towards about 10 o'clock, you're right there on the road. That's part of the trail.
Wow.
And so you see how rough it is. Over on the left side of the picture is a creek. You can tell because it's irregular in that would be a water source, which the area was full of them. And so if you consider the proximity of the trail to that water, that was the normal thing because troops got to have water. So the North Vietnamese would run their roads and their high-speed trails generally parallel or very close to a water source so they could, you know, constantly stop and fill up their canteens. And in this picture, I can see where all these hills and stuff, the water's running down and it's feeding into this. I wouldn't call it a river, but a larger water source. If that area on the left was open, it would be good for making an LZ. Other than that, the only place I see on there that you might have a chance of landing a team would be in the dead center of the picture. There's a hill that looks like it's cleared on the top. And yeah, right there. And it may not actually be clear. It may just look clear from the air. But generally, we would try to go in on like a hillside that's had been previously cleared because it's easier for the choppers to get in and out of.
Now, with the SOG operations, and of course, outside of your role, would some of the smaller recon teams try to have reconnaissance points along the rivers, just following troop movements, just, you know, due to the water being a natural point?
Okay, so let's say that place towards the lower right where I can tell is part of the road right there. A recon team's job, they might be sitting up on the hill, going up from where the road is at the very bottom, at about going up towards 2 o'clock. It looks like it runs up a hill, and that could even be another trail coming down to meet the road. But they would maybe be assigned to just sit and observe the road and count vehicles or troops or what have you. So that was normally a small recon team. That was normally their main mission, was to gather intelligence about road traffic and that, and troop traffic on these trails. A
Now,
secondary mission was always to take a prisoner, but that didn't always work out.
now recently I've been talking to Force Recon Marine, Bruce Norton, and he mentioned that when they were in the field, that they really didn't communicate over the radio via voice, but they communicated by, you know, squelching the radio, hitting the handset. So would the recon teams do that as well, or would they just
Yeah.
communicate in low whispers?
Well, if you're in a situation where the bad guys are all around you but they don't maybe know that you're there, you may have had an opportunity to radio to your covey or something, and he may be flying over and trying to ask you something, but you don't want to talk, so you could just click the mic and do the squelch thing. Like 2 clicks would mean you're okay right now. 1 click would mean I can't make any sound right now. So you know that there's bad guys all around you. I mean, normally you would hope that you can actually talk, because then the plane would actually know what your situation is. But if they're right on top of you, all you can do is squelch. We called it break and squelch.
Well, I mean, with that too, I mean, I guess in those situations where you've got envy all around you, I guess there's always that just fear of, you know, or I wouldn't say perhaps fear, but the anticipation of at any moment you can get spotted. You know, your heart's got to be beating out of your chest, just because in those situations, it's anything can go wrong in a split second.
Normally, well, like in my case with Hatchet Force, because there were so many of us, they knew exactly where you were. But with the recon teams, a lot of times they may have trackers following them, but the tracker may not know exactly where they're at. And they would try to then move away from the path, and then maybe they could even get off to the sides and the tracker would go past them, and they might even have a chance of capturing a prisoner.
Wow.
But once a team got discovered, then they're not long for that area. They're going to end up in a firefight and either get overrun or take mass casualties, and have to be pulled out. And that was becoming in late 68. That's what was going on where I was at Khartoum. We were having teams completely overrun, everybody killed or maybe captured, but a lot of times we'd be able to go in and recover the bodies. But it was becoming, and again, a lot of this was due to the mole in Saigon, who was actually a North Vietnamese colonel, and he was working for the Vietnamese at SOG headquarters. And so he knew the coordinates every time a mission went in. He knew where they were going to land, and he knew what their mission was. And so we were starting to lose teams right and left. And that's why a lot of times what I'd call the official LZ became maybe a secondary or a tertiary LZ. So you'd go in on a different LZ, they'd be waiting for you on LZ1, and you go in on LZ2, which could be a click or two away. So you're far enough away from them that once you get put in, they don't know where you're at. And that's the hope. But so many times the guys would go in and they'd be waiting on them, and they'd have anti-aircraft around the LZ and bunkers even. And because there's only so many of those cleared areas to be used as LZs. And once the North Vietnamese figured that out, they'd put watchers on those LZs. I saw a picture just a couple of days ago about a big clearing like that up in one corner of it, there was a little hut for the watchers. But mostly what we saw was kind of like a tree stand, a platform up in the trees where the guy could hide up in the tree and not be seen from the air. And if a team would land on that LZ, he'd just fire a shot and let everybody know, hey, come this way. So, yeah.
Well, speaking of the trails, I've got a better picture here, of course, that from one of in your collection, but this just gives us a better eye view of the trails themselves.
Okay. And this is something that I discovered actually a couple of months ago when I was doing a podcast with Bud Gibson. If you look in the dead center of the picture, you can see very clearly, you can see very clearly that's the road. Okay. Now, if you move very slowly to the right, keep going right there. That's a foot trail.
Yep.
And see, and so it parallels the road. And way over to the left, stop. Now go straight down. Okay, right there. You see there's another trail.
Yes, sir.
And that one has been pretty heavily bombed. And my guess would be that it got bombed so bad. You see all the bomb craters and that. Everything white that you see is a bomb crater. So my guess is what they did is they moved from there over to the middle of the screen there. And then they had that other footpath. So the road would be the main thing, and then up to the right of the road there was the foot trail. So the troops could walk the trail and then the vehicles could follow the road. But obviously our planes figured out what they were doing, because at the top of the picture, you can kind of see where they've started bombing the, and so the road would wind around, it'd go up over on the left, and then it made not quite a 90-degree turn. And you see at the bottom of the hill where that footpath is up there, keep going up, 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 up. Okay, right there. So you see, that's like a bluff, and it dropped down, but you see that road from way over to the left,
Yep.
curved around. Okay, now I think right where your cursor's at, that's continuation of the footpath. And if you go up, you see a big clearing. Now that clearing could be one of several things. That could be a big camp area, or it could be what we used as an LZ to land choppers in. Because I can see 2 or 3 different roads on this picture, and they all kind of converge at certain points. But that footpath that your cursor's on is at the very, very top of the picture on the other side of the clearing. You can see where it continues on. Yeah. So I got to think that this was a very heavily populated NVA area, because there's too many different roads and stuff that are circling and converging, and that clearing would have made a perfect LZ for 3 or 4 choppers at one time. But it could also have been, you can't really tell in the picture, but directly above your cursor in the middle of that field, it's a darker area. Yeah, right there. So what is that? Was it some hooches? Was it, who knows? I can't really tell in the picture. But this was typical of the terrain that we went into. I see something else in the picture that is very strange, but I can't tell what it is. And that's back down where, when the footpath came down off of that mountain. Now go to your right, go over to the right. Now, just at 1 o'clock from your cursor, there's some, yeah, I can't tell what that is. It's not shaped like a bomb crater. You see, it's almost like a square. So yeah, so it doesn't look, it's not normal, that's for sure. But what is it? I don't know. I see another spot. If you go to the right from that square, go right. Now, right there. What is that? Because I can see a trail going into that and coming out of that. But again, it's something that, considering the terrain, it's something that's not normal. So I'm thinking it's man-made. But you know, the detail's not enough to be able to tell for sure what it is. So these are the kind of things, before a team would go into a area on a mission, the team leader would fly over with one of the pilots, take pictures, and they'd go back, develop the pictures, and try to determine what all is going on in that area, because it could make a difference on where they decide to put in. I mean, the only, what I would call a good spot that I see in this picture is that big clearing at the top. But then again, what's in that clearing or what's around that clearing? If I was the NVA, I'd have anti-aircraft guns around it, and knowing that it, I mean, could be a possible LZ. So there's a lot of things in this picture that the more times I look at this picture, the more things I see that I question, what are they? What are we looking at here? That brings it into real focus. What we talked about originally with you got a footpath going to the right of the road, and then what had been the road way over to the left. But it shows you the kind of terrain, because that footpath is going along, but then when it gets right there, it's going way up that hill and then down the other side and continuing on to that clearing. And then you can see where it goes out the other side of the clearing. So,
Well, Terry,
but that's the terrain, up one hill, down the next.
it sparks a question for me, is that I know with, of course, being Hatchet Force, you get flown into these areas and the NVA know exactly where you are, but did you ever have to do any BDAs along these trails or footpaths after airstrikes in any regard?
Okay. Yeah. So they had this brilliant idea. They knew a recon team had identified what was believed to be a regimental base camp. So a regiment would be what, 2,000 men, I think, 1,000 men, something like that. Anyway, so the idea was the B-52s were going to go in and bomb the hell out of it, and they were going to put us in right on top of it before all the dirt had even settled back onto the ground. So they had this brilliant idea. So the B-52s go over and they do their thing. And then they put us in. The dirt's not even settled on the ground yet. And we're creating these mushroom clouds of dirt from the rotors of the choppers. We get in there and there's this massive bunker complex. I mean, there's in these caves and tunnels that they built, there's bowls of steaming hot rice still on the table, hot tea or whatever. There's a few dead guys laying around, but not very many. And what would happen is, so this was a large area, probably several thousand NVA. When the bombs drop, a lot of them would suffer concussions and hearing loss, and they'd be disoriented. But within hour and a half, maybe 2 hours of us being in there after the bombs have dropped, we're getting the hell beat out of us because they're mad now. We've stirred up a hornet's nest. And it just goes to show that they were masters at building these tunnel complexes. Well, they'd get in the tunnel complexes, and the standard formula for these B-52 strikes was first thing in the morning. So they're in their tunnels and stuff. We bomb the hell out of them, and they come out and they're looking for revenge. And so we'd end up getting the hell kicked out of us. And that was a fairly common scenario. So this idea that the B-52s were going to kill everybody on the ground and we're going to get all this intelligence and stuff, that was somebody's delusional thoughts, because it didn't work that way. And we knew it, but the powers who be just refused to acknowledge it. Oh, go in there and get all this intelligence. And we would get some intelligence. I mean, you could find documents and what have you if you went into the right tunnel. But overall, you're just in there to draw them out and get shot up and work more airstrikes. Another one of those things that looking back on it, we question the people that were planning these things, where their minds were at. Because, so.
Well, speaking of the planners, and with a lot of these orders and missions that get detailed, were the missions being drafted by men who had experience in the field, or is this coming from someone who just had a rank and thought it was a good idea?
Okay. Every one of our missions somebody would plan a mission, and it could be at the local level and it could be down in Saigon. You know, for instance, maybe down in Saigon at headquarters, they'd want to know, is there any evidence of tanks in a specific area? So you send a recon team in looking along the road, looking for tank tread marks. We had one team that did that, and they went back to Saigon for the debrief and said, yeah, there's tanks. We saw tanks. So what was the response? Oh, we don't believe you. So what do you do with some idiot like that? You go back in and you find a piece of a tank tread and you come back for debriefing and you take it out of your rucksack and throw it on the table and say, do you understand what this is? Well, that's a tank tread. Thank you. What did we tell you last time? There's tanks. But that's the way it went. You had people. So that was one planning stage. But okay, so they plan and they say, well, we want to know if there's tanks, blah, blah, blah. Well, then it goes back to the Joint Chiefs. And the Joint Chiefs had to approve, from what we've learned, had to approve virtually every mission. Some missions actually were approved by the president himself, depending on what the mission was and where it was. So virtually all of our missions eventually got approved by the Joint Chiefs and the politicians in Washington, you know. And but the idea for a specific mission may have originated locally. We may have had a recon team that went in and said, well, like when I got shot the first time, a recon team found what they believed to be a truck refueling station. So it goes back and it goes to Saigon and it goes back to the Joint Chiefs. So we want to send a Hatchet Force company in to deal with this, what we believe is a truck stop, and we may be able to take some prisoners. We'll be able to photograph vehicles, what have you, and all that. And it got approved, and we went in and we did what we did. So, yeah, but some of the missions actually got approved all the way up to the president.
Well, I mean, even with that though, it kind of boggles my mind going back to the tank tread story. The fact that, you've got trusted teams out in the field reporting on the intelligence and what they're finding, and some jackass is like, no, that can't be true. It's impossible.
And the general feeling was, if you're not going to trust what we tell you, why in the hell are we even going out there and doing it? Get somebody else to do it that you believe. But you're some desk jockey. You're not on the ground. We're on the ground. We know what we saw. And generally, there's pictures to go along with the written reports, And yeah. But this is what happens when you got politicians running a war. Every war, it's the same, So since they have no clue what's going on, they dream up these brilliant ideas. Oh, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? And it's like, dude, have you ever been on the ground? I mean, and that's how you lose people, because you go in and do things you shouldn't have even tried to do because it doesn't make sense. So,
well, I mean, you bring up a great point that I know I've talked about with some other veterans, is that why are politicians or individuals who don't have, combat experience, field experience, allowed to make decisions when they have no idea what they're talking about? They've never been there. They don't have the experience. Like, make it make sense.
it's because it's the nature of how our government is structured. The people that are making the decisions, they're politicians. They're not, some of them may have had some military experience, but more than likely not. The Joint Chiefs, they may have had experience in World War II or Korea, but this ain't World War II and it ain't Korea. It's a completely different type of war, but they're trying to fight it as if it was still, we're fighting the Nazis or the Chinese or whatever. Well, we were fighting Chinese, but you know, I mean, I had a uniform to prove that. But so yeah, I mean, you got people that really don't know what they're doing, planning things that are going to get us killed, just because they think it might be worthwhile. So,
Well, and that, I mean, a lot of the contributing factors to, a lot of the deaths in the Vietnam War could be traced back to decisions made by politicians, and that's
oh, there's no question about that, and we all knew that, but we volunteered to do it. So, okay, fine, we'll do it. Um, that's just like I, I talked to the cousin last Sunday. I talked to a cousin of one of my friends who is still MIA, and he wanted to hear some stories about his cousin and all that. Well, the guy that put me in touch with him is the co-author of a couple of the books. This one is called SOG Medic, and it was written by one of our medics and with this other gentleman, Robert Dumont, who's a journalist. And just talking to him and reading through. I'm reading the book again. I've already got the book, but I'm reading it again. And of course, every time you read one of these, you read things that you didn't catch the first time you read it. But some of the stories point out exactly what we're talking about, the futility of why in the hell are we doing this? I just this morning was reading a story where they went into a target area called Juliet 9, which was right by this river. It was called the Bra because part of the river, it made these curves and whatever. Well, that's Juliet 9. Well, Hotel 9 was to just due west of that. And Hotel 9 was one of those areas, if you go into it, you know you're going to get your ass kicked. I've been in Hotel 9 twice, and I've had my ass kicked twice. My very first combat mission was in Hotel 9. And of course, then I was young and stupid and I didn't know any better, and nobody told me you're going to get your butt kicked, but we did. They put us in a regimental base camp area. You know, they already knew it was there. Yeah, we'll send 2 companies in instead of just one. And I think we lasted 2 days, so, sometimes the recon teams would identify an area, for instance, or a target, we'll call it. And then when they go back and do their debrief and report on what they saw or heard or found, then that's when the idea takes shape to, oh, well, let's send a big team in and see what we can exploit. And sometimes it works out, sometimes it didn't. Usually it didn't work out. And then part of the idea was, well, maybe we can kill a lot of them with airstrikes. Maybe the guys on the ground aren't going to kill a bunch, but my last mission, January 1970, we did a roadblock and we put 2 companies in, and each company was on opposite sides of the trail on these mountaintops. And we had traffic, North Vietnamese traffic backed up for miles. And they were working airstrikes right and left. And it was, targets of opportunity because they'd fly over. You see all these trucks backed up and they bombed the hell out of them. So in 1971, I got picked to go to Miami Beach, Florida. Every month, they'd fly a group of Purple Heart recipients down to Miami Beach for a few days of, rest and relaxation, we'll say. And while I was down there, one of the Miami newspapers, the Miami Herald, ran an article about one of our missions, which happened to be this roadblock mission. And according to the people they were interviewing, which was apparently a pilot, supposedly the Air Force got credited with over 5,000 kills from the airstrikes. We sure didn't do it popping off rounds on the ground, but with all those trucks backed up, you know, they were working airstrikes day and night. And according to this article, the official kill was over 5,000 NVA. Who knows? Nobody on the ground went down there and counted them. So it's always an estimate. And since the powers who be were, what's the right word? They were all hung up on body counts. So, you know, oh man, 5,000. Wow, man. Truth be known, it was probably way, way less than that, but who the hell knows again, because nobody went down and counted them. So, yeah, so that's how brilliant ideas from people that don't know what they're doing get good guys killed.
Amen to that. I mean, in my time interviewing Vietnam veterans, talked to a lot of Marines, of course, now working into the SOG world, and almost it's the universal statement is the planning, the politicians, the mindset in some ways from Washington, or those that had never truly had the experience, they got good people killed that shouldn't have been killed.
Another good idea, how stupid the whole thing is. In Cambodia, we could put a recon team in. We were not allowed to put in a Hatchet Force company. They were only allowed to have air support from helicopter gunships. They were not allowed to have any bombers or jets or any of that air support. So it's no wonder they lost a lot of guys. You know, you only get minimal air support. And we couldn't send a company in to try to rescue a recon team because they weren't allowed to do it.
Yep.
Now, truth be told, sometimes the border got moved a little bit, you might say. There are instances, and I've read some of the stories where, yeah, maybe the border's here, but it needed to be 10 miles over. And that happened a few times. But when they did that, man, they got to be very careful in the write-ups and make sure that, and it was because of the U.S. ambassadors in Cambodia and Laos. They're the ones that made the rules about, like where I was at, we could only go 20 miles inside Laos. Well, if we could have gone even further in, we could have done a lot more damage than what we did. But the ambassador would only allow us to go 20 miles. Originally, it was only 10 miles. Then finally, it was 20 miles. But and we were able to utilize all the air support we could get, whereas the guys in Cambodia, they were at a very big disadvantage. So,
Well,
you know, again,
and as you
politics.
know, a key aspect of the United States military strategy is the supporting arms that we bring to the table. Artillery, air power. I mean,
Yep.
you can look at that from really 1944 to the present period. And when you're inserting recon teams and all they get is a helicopter gunship, no wonder. I mean, teams are going to get annihilated out there. I mean, they don't stand a chance.
And this was all because the U.S. ambassador in Cambodia was trying to suck up to the ruling party in Cambodia. And yes, he knew that we had teams in there, but if we used jets or whatever air support and the word got out, because he's trying to downplay everything, you know, okay, so the Cambodians get upset. Who cares? They had the Russians coming into the port of Sihanouk and offloading supplies, and then they were trucking them up to send into South Vietnam. So we bomb a few of them, you know, argue with it, but that's not how politics works. So yeah,
No,
it's ridiculous.
it is, and
So
it's and then there's a reason why. From my experience talking to Vietnam veterans after the war, a lot of people lost trust in the government simply for decisions like that were made, where an ambassador or politicians made a decision or they passed a legislation that ended up getting people killed that they knew.
yep. I just read something yesterday and people are reposting it. I saw it again this morning on Faceless Book. Um, because the military is having trouble recruiting and meeting their recruiting numbers, they're going to reduce troop strength by 24,000, which include in the Army, which includes 3,000 special ops guys. Ridiculous, totally ridiculous.
I agree.
But that's how civilians make decisions. Oh, if we can't make our numbers, we'll make our numbers by reducing troop strength, and then we'll make our numbers.
Well, it's
So
like,
yeah,
okay, if you want to reduce your troop strength, fine, but it's think about special forces. I mean, they have specifically assigned missions. If anything, you want to keep them for when you need to send them into where shit gets hot. To actually, you can't send in a regular trained grunt, perhaps, to do the job of a reconnaissance or to gather intelligence. They don't have the training. That's mind-boggling.
they spend millions of dollars training us to do certain things, and then they turn around and throw it all away. You know, it makes no sense.
No, well,
You know,
I mean, and even getting back to this as well. I mean, we've talked about the bombing of the trails and the supposed body count, but even then, you and I have mentioned this before. The tunneling, the creation of the bunkers was brilliant by the NVA. They were brilliant engineers in terms to the capabilities they had, and that's why I was going to bring up this photograph of a bunker that you stumbled upon and photographed.
so this particular bunker held maybe two guys, and all up and down along the trails, the roadways and that, you'd find these little bunkers. And the whole purpose of them was if an airstrike or something's coming in and these guys are marching down the trail, or even in their trucks, they'd jump out of the trucks and they'd run and get into these little bunkers. When the airstrikes were over, they'd come back out. Um, and you see, there's nothing much to it. They just hollow it out, kind of like a cave with an opening at the top big enough, and then they took some tree branches and to give them some protection for any shrapnel or anything. And then when they'd get in there, they'd lay down. And so any shrapnel that might come in would come in through that opening at the top of the picture there. So, I mean, very simple. It probably didn't take them but a couple hours to build one of them. And they'd have road crews, the 599th Transportation Battalion or whatever. They'd go up and down the road and they build all these bunkers to try to mitigate their losses from airstrikes. Nothing fancy, but yet effective.
Well, and I was going to ask too, speaking upon, just the camouflage applied here, were these bunkers easy to spot on the trail, or did some of them you really had to look for and pay attention to?
Oh, they're easy to spot. I mean, when I took this picture, I'm standing on the road, on the trail. So, I mean, it's very clear what it is. And there were a lot of them. So, yeah, I mean, they didn't need to be camouflaged from us. They just, from the air, you wouldn't be able to see that anyway because you'd be looking straight down on it. It was just to provide some level of protection for the troops that were moving down the road if there was an airstrike.
Well, even in the planning on that's brilliant. on the NVA part of something simple just for some basic cover, just so, instead of losing 50% casualties, maybe you only take 20 or 25% in this regard.
There's a lot of people who even today think that the North Vietnamese were a bunch of peasants, poorly trained and what have you, and that's about as far from the truth as it gets. We're not talking about Viet Cong over in South Vietnam. We're talking about North Vietnamese troops in Laos and Cambodia and into southern North Vietnam. They were very disciplined. They were very well trained, and they were a force to be reckoned with.
Absolutely.
We respected them because we knew what we were up against, and their tactics evolved over time just like ours did, and a lot of their tactics evolved to deal with our tactics. So yeah, they were no slouches. They were very good, hardcore, well-trained troops,
Well,
and you had to respect that.
absolutely. I mean, every Vietnam veteran I've ever talked to that fought against the NVA at any point has told me something along the same lines that you did. The utmost respect, because they were hardcore, well-trained troops, and they were not there for a tour of duty. They were there to fight and win or fight and die.
Probably early, no later than mid '69, they had trained these hunter killer teams. So they would send in, if they knew we were in there, they'd send these hunter killer teams in if they had one near enough to where we were at. And these teams were specially trained in all kinds of stuff, explosives, just all kinds of tactics that the average NVA wouldn't have. And they'd send these hunter killer teams in after us, and they were good. They knew what they were doing. They had one purpose, and that was to eliminate us. And they were a force to be reckoned with.
Well, and I mean, with the NVA strategy that was attempted to mold it to combat SOG, even then, I mean, if we were able to get true, accurate counts statistically, you would still find in overwhelming numbers NVA casualties exceeded that of what was caused against USOG operatives.
Oh yeah, yeah. And again, any numbers that you hear, you have to look at those numbers with a jaundiced eye, because these are some intelligence idiot's estimation of numbers. Now, like we go in the middle of a regimental base camp. Okay, we know it's a regimental base camp. We know how many men are in a regiment, but it wasn't always like that. You could not always, and a lot of times if a team was discovered, there wouldn't be time for them to assess any kind of numbers at all. All they knew is that they were getting hit by a platoon or a company, or several companies. So it's all kind of relative. And every situation was kind of different from that respect, because it was a fluid situation. It all depended on where the team got put in relation to where the NVA base camps were at, or the truck stops, or any of that. So it was really all relative. And so one mission would depend on the results from a previous mission as far as knowledge of the area. There were times when they would send a recon team into an area, and maybe they got run out, but they might turn right around because they still wanted more information. They might put them right back in a week later in the same area, maybe on a different LZ or something, but generally in the same general area, because they still wanted to know more about that particular area, and
Well, even with that too, the varied missions outside of, NVA anticipation for Hatchet Force, outside of the terrain, you also have the environment. And we've talked about this a little bit, but I wanted to bring up this photograph of part of the environment, not just the terrain, but some of the creatures that you could encounter in these parts of the world.
well, this picture was taken behind our camp, and it's just a bunch of water buffalo. Looks like they've plowed up all the ground, getting ready to plant something, but we didn't run into like herds of water buffalo over in Laos. We ran into the North Vietnamese would use elephants to carry loads. Every once in a while, somebody would run into the team would either hear or actually see a tiger. I mean, there are a couple of instances where Americans were killed by tigers. But other than that, you just didn't run into a bunch of animals over there because everything was on the move. So other than the elephants, it was vehicles or bicycles. Hell, the bicycles, they wouldn't ride the bicycles. They'd walk alongside of them, and every bicycle could carry up to about 200 pounds of supplies. So they'd kind of rig a bicycle up like a pack mule, and then they'd just walk alongside of it because there's nowhere to get on it and ride because it's packed like a pack mule. So, but animal wise, maybe if you ran into a really remote village or something, you might find some pigs and chickens or something. But that was very rare, really. It wasn't common at all.
Well, and then I know from some of your photographs within the base camps or even behind the base camp, I can't remember exactly where this one was taken, but there were mascots or pets that were used. I think I remember one of the photographs, there's a ocelot that you
Yep,
took a
that was our
picture of.
pet ocelot. Yeah.
And
I
I
don't even remember where we got it. I I I don't remember where we got it, but that was it right there. That's our little ocelot. I didn't even know what an ocelot was, and I think one of the yards must have brought it to us. Um, it's just a little like in his picture. It looks like maybe a cat with a funny shaped head or something, and that's about how big it was. It was like a you know 5 to 10 pound cat,
Now, was it
and
friendly?
yeah, yeah. I mean, we pick it up, pet it, play with it, and whatever, and feed it. And of course, animals tend to have a loyalty to the people who feed them.
That's true.
And I've read or listened to a couple of interviews with a couple of the guys I was with, and they've all mentioned this ocelot, our pet ocelot, because it was such an unusual animal to start with. And yeah, and
Well,
kind
and
of
even just
um,
of the unique.
down at the FOB, there's a couple of instances of guys that had these big boa constrictors or whatever for pets. No,
No.
not me. No. I had my two bad experiences over there with snakes, and my philosophy was if it has no shoulders, it needs to be dead. Because I had my experience with the bamboo viper and the one with the cobra, and I don't choose to repeat them, and not me,
Well,
you know.
even with the uniqueness, I mean, I've never heard of guys having the snakes as pets. No, thank you on that. But I know common for dogs. I've seen that. I've seen some of the
Yeah.
patrol boats down south with the Brownwater Navy. Those guys had pet otters. I mean, all sorts of
Oh
stuff.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's according to where you're at as far as what's maybe available. And I think the idea of having pets kind of maybe maybe it helped remind guys of home or something, you know. You got a pet back home, you got a dog or a cat, and over here you got an ocelot or an otter or whatever. And there were a lot of different animals over there. It's just that your encounters with them might be very rare and far and few between. Just again, just depending on where you're at. Where our camp was, other than water buffalo and our ocelot, some of in the villages you'd have pigs for food. Um, I don't really. Well, I mean, like sometimes if we weren't on a mission, like on Sundays, like I would go up in the mountains outside of camp with some of my yards, and we'd hunt monkeys. And then they'd bring the monkeys back and cut them up and cook them up, and we'd have a big feast.
Now, what kind of monkeys are we talking about here? Orangutan,
Four-legged,
chimpanzee?
four-legged animals with a tail. I mean, I don't know the species of
Right.
monkey. They were just, probably 10 to 15 pounds, smaller. They weren't like baboons or, big monkeys like
Right.
that. They were just little, you know, um, one of the guys had a pet monkey down at camp. Again, same thing. You feed him, he's going to stick around. And, but, stuff like that it was more rare than it was the norm, you know. Uh,
Well, speaking of just being in camp too, Jason told me that I should ask you a question about some rice wine.
oh my God. Oh my God. So the Montagnards, one of their favorite drinks was rice wine. And what rice wine was, they had these big earthenware jugs that stood about 3 foot high. They'd probably hold 4 or 5 gallons of water. So they had these, the best way I can describe what they looked like was, the cakes of, I guess they're deodorant that you see in urinals in the
Yes.
bathroom, those big white cakes. So they would be about that size, and it was fermented rice that was compressed into these cakes. So you'd put a couple of those cakes in the bottom of this earthenware jug, and then you'd pack some palm leaves in over it to hold them on the bottom so they wouldn't float up. And then you'd fill it with water and you'd let it sit for a while. And I don't know what proof it was, but let's just say that moonshine didn't hold a candle to this stuff. It was high proof. And there's a whole bunch of my pictures of in March, and this would have been in the early part of March. We'd had a lot of casualties, and we were having to replace a lot of our Montagnards. And we decided to throw a party for the yards. Just, hey, we love you. Thanks for having our back. We're going to show you how much we appreciate you. Of course, you got to remember, one of our Montagnards, just a lowly private, if you want to call them that. They didn't have rank, but they were making more than a Vietnamese Army lieutenant was making. We paid them well. So we're going to have this party. So I don't know who came up with the idea, but they took one of the King-B helicopters, the ones flown by the Vietnamese pilots.
Yeah.
And an American went with them, and they flew over the estate of the president of South Vietnam, and they shot this animal. It kind of looked like a water buffalo, but it was called a gohr, Gohr. And so it's a big, like a big beefy cow with horns and whatever. And they shot it. They shot it with a machine gun, and they dropped down, rigged it up with ropes, lifted it up, and brought it back to camp. And the yards butchered it up into like shish kebab. And we had this big pavilion, concrete floor, had a roof on it, and we could show movies under there or whatever. And that thing was lined with these jugs of rice wine. And I had a taste for rice wine, I guess you'd say. And yeah. Now where those guys are sitting there sucking down that rice wine, if you came out towards me where I took the picture, the head of that gore, yeah, there it is. So that was for them, that was kind of like a symbol of good luck, by having the head there. So while we're having this party, the colonel from down at the main camp comes up, and he's got these guys with him. I don't know what to call them other than journalists or whatever. And I've always thought it was really strange because here we are, it's a classified operation, classified compound. Even the MPs couldn't come on our compound to try to recover all the stolen vehicles that we had. And there's two guys, one's got a movie camera and one's got a still camera, and they're taking all these pictures. So about, when was it, honey? 15 years ago? Well, it was before we moved here. So we were at the old house, probably 17 or 18 years ago. The History Channel one week was running when it was still the real History Channel. They were running a series called about elite troops of different countries around the world. So one night it was elite troops in the United States, and the whole thing was about SOG. And it had been declassified by then. So, so about 20 minutes into it, because it's talking about some of our missions and, all this different stuff. And about 20 minutes into it, they show the pictures from this party, and they showed some video. And here I am, drunk as a skunk on this video. And I called for my wife to come in and see it. And by the time she got in there, it was gone. So I think she went back to whatever she was doing, probably sewing. And at 40 minutes into it, here I am again, still drunk. And I called her, and she came in and was able to see it. And about 2 weeks after the party, I got this big envelope in the mail, and it was the black and white pictures of this party. And I never could put two and two together and figure out how these people were able to take these pictures on a classified compound. It just didn't make sense. But yeah, Jason is real familiar with my pictures. And yeah, and then one time, after we moved down to the main FOB, there was a yard village just outside the north end of the camp off to the east. And I went down there with some of my yards one Sunday when we weren't on a mission. And they had a big party, I was the honored guest. And being young and stupid and having a liking for rice wine, I drank the village chief under the table. Well, the downside to that was I now had a reputation that I had to live up to. So every Sunday, if we weren't on a mission, I had to be down in the village for another, and it was almost became like a contest. And I finally figured out, if I let somebody else drink me under, then I don't have to come down here and do this every Sunday. So I finally let one of the yards drink me down, and I didn't have to go do that anymore. But the yards loved it that I drank the village chief under the table, and I thought maybe that was going to be a cardinal sin or something, but no, it was like, oh, you number one, you know, and that's why I guess I had complete trust in my yards. I knew that when we went to the field, they were going to watch my back,
Right.
and that proved to be the case.
Well,
And but yeah, rice wine, and if you weren't in the village drinking rice wine, um, I had a refrigerator in my room that I bribed the guy down at the PX, and next time they go out a load of fridges in, I made sure I got mine.
there it is.
Yeah, and that tape deck there, that's an Akai X 1800 SD. I still have that tape deck out in my workshop, and I had about probably 30 to 40 reel-to-reel tapes of music from, you know, late 60s, very early 70s. And I've still got 6 reels left that I got to do, but I was able to convert all those reels onto CDs
Wow.
so they won't be lost. So when I'm out there in my workshop every day working on a saddle or whatever leather project I'm working on, I got a 200 disc CD changer, and I just got my music going.
That's awesome. Now,
And
if I can interrupt real quick, I'm
uh
curious, what kind of music were you listening to in 69 and 70?
of course, Elvis, um, the Animals. Um, I wasn't into like so much like the Rolling Stones, even though I've got a couple of their albums. I've got Creedence Clearwater Revival, some of those kind of groups, but that really wasn't my thing. I was more into Gene Pitney, Johnny Mathis, Glenn Campbell. Um, well, I think I had a Nancy Sinatra album. Um, that was my other tape deck. Um, oh, yeah, that type of music. Um, and I've got some more. Um, there were groups that probably you've never even heard of, like the Coven. Um, they did the music for that series of Billy Jack movies.
Yes, sir.
Um, Helen Reddy, Olivia Newton-John, um, some of that kind of. I mean, it was a big variety of stuff,
No kidding.
but um, and then as you see, um, a lot of paperback books. I did a lot of reading. I still do. Um, but I had my music, those big speakers I ordered from the PX in Japan and had them shipped to me.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. That tape deck there, I'm trying to think. I can't remember what happened to it. I know I brought it home with me. The receiver sitting up there, that was a Pioneer receiver that I got from the PX in Japan. I had that. It got stolen along with the tape deck. That's what happened. My
Of course
house
you
got
did.
burglarized back in 1982, and
This.
they took that stuff. But luckily, they didn't get all my tapes.
Well, even then too, it's just amazing that you've got these tape decks and it's an awesome glimpse into a life 50 years ago. I mean, and I think that's one of the things I love about our world of technology today is, we're able to listen to the music of the 60s and the 70s and analyze the cultural diversity from country to rock to soul to Motown. I mean, I love it.
When, let's see, this was in almost mid-March of 69. I was still at the yard camp, and I had a transistor radio so I could listen to Armed Forces Vietnam radio. And I had another besides those two tape decks, I had another reel-to-reel tape deck. And so I had my radio, and then I had the two microphones from this other tape deck sitting there, and I was recording music off of the radio, the transistor radio, and recording it on reel-to-reel. And I think I was recording Joe Cocker, and all of a sudden I hear thump, thump. Well, right away I knew it's mortar rounds and they're incoming. So I yelled incoming, and everybody scattered. The first round hit directly over the poker table. The second round hit directly over the bar, because they knew that's where the Americans would be hanging out in the evenings. And that shows you how good these guys were with a mortar, with just how many paces from point A to point B, and they had it all plotted out. And that's what started the attack on our camp for the next couple of nights, until it culminated when they tried to overrun us and had, I guess, what you'd call a massive failure. Yeah.
Well, if I may ask, with that attack that happened,
Uh-huh.
after it's over, what do you do with the NVA dead? Do you bury them individually? Do they get put into a mass grave?
Oh, hell no.
What happens?
Adjacent to our camp was an engineer camp, and their primary job, it was like a blacktop facility. And so their main job was they're out there blacktopping some of the roads during the daytime. And I know one of my buddies who was with me there, he seems to remember that the North Vietnamese, or the Viet Cong, were actually hitting the engineer camp harder than they were hitting our camp. I remember it a little differently, but nevertheless, um, uh, they, where were we going with this? I forget. Oh, that's how my mind.
That's okay.
Sometimes.
Well, what happened to the NVA dead? Were they buried?
Okay.
Yeah.
So, keeping in mind that this was about 10 days before I got shot the first time. So the film in my camera, I used it up that next day taking pictures. And I had a picture of this huge pile of dead VC. And so the engineers took their bulldozers and they just dug a big hole and buried them in a pile. I mean, what are you going to do?
Right.
You don't know who they are. You don't know their names, where they're from, or anything else. And they're all locals. I mean, local Viet Cong. But you just dig a hole and bury them. You know, I mean, it is what it is.
It's the name of the game.
It's the name of the game. That's what you get for trying to overrun our camp. Yeah.
Now, how long did that attack last in terms of 2 days, 3 nights? What was the process there?
They hit us for a couple of nights in a row, but the one night is put an end. Well, we had rocket attacks for a few days after that, but when they tried to overrun the camp, it started out with the mortars, but then it became a ground attack from all sides. And like I say, it didn't go well for them. The next day, we went out on a sweep. Like where the picture with all the water buffaloes, that was kind of behind our camp and just to the north of it. So there was a little knoll back there, and we got back there because we knew a lot of the like the rounds, the mortar rounds and that were coming from there. And we got back there and we found trees. We found all kinds of, and again, me not being a dope head, I didn't know what they were, but little foil packets on the ground. We found all kinds of bloody bandages and whatever. But what they had done was apparently they had snatched up a bunch of locals and forced them and they chained them to a tree and got them high on heroin, and they gave them a bunch of brand new counterfeit Vietnamese money and said, okay, your job is to fire mortar rounds at the camp. And yeah, we just found all kinds of stuff. And I found a bunch of that stuff, the money and whatever, and I donated it down to 5th Group headquarters for the museum down there. But that's what they would do. They'd a lot of times grab some of the local citizens and force them, like chaining them to the trees, and say, okay, your job is to drop mortar rounds down the tube. And then when they decided to retreat, they unchained them and they melted into the hillside. So, I mean, we always knew that they're out there watching us. We always knew that. And there was always patrols being sent out up into those hills and that, looking for them, because we know they're up there, you know. And but especially the special forces camps, like our camp at the yard camp had been an OA camp, so the defenses were set up to where it's very unlikely that it's going to get overrun.
Right.
And we had plenty of armament. I remember on the side of our camp, which I call it the front of the camp because it faced Highway 14, the road going into our camp, and that on that side, we had 55-gallon drums of what we call foo gas, which was gas with some stuff called a chemical called naphthalene. It came in metal cans, and you mix it. Fells naphtha soap is essentially the same chemical, and so you make jellied gasoline. What is jellied gasoline?
Napalm.
Napalm. So you put it in 55-gallon drums that are angled out at about a 45-degree angle from your wall of your camp, and you put a white phosphorus grenade in it with a fuse on a clacker like what you'd set off a claymore with. So if the bad guys are coming across the open area across your chopper pad, click, and you burn them up with foo gas. You know, it's a nasty cleanup job, but whatever, you know. So, I mean, we had no shortage of weapons. And, yeah, I got a couple of stories. I don't think I'll tell, though, just because the tender young high school ears probably don't need to hear such graphic stories. But I learned what a 50 cal tracer would do to a person.
I'm sure.
And, you know, 10,000 degrees, you know. But nevertheless, the film that I took, and I had several pictures of this big pile of the dead bad guys. I didn't even think about it, and of course, I didn't know I was going to get shot in about a week either. But I sent the film down to the PX to be printed, and I didn't realize it, but any pictures of any pictures of dead bodies, for instance, they would confiscate. That's one of my best friends from high school, Colin. I just had lunch with him the other day, so he'll have to leave me a message. So they confiscated the pictures, so I don't have those pictures.
Right.
But then when I got shot, the pictures of the guy that shot me, I have those pictures because I had those developed over in Japan while I was in the hospital. Which reminds me, one of the goodies that I brought to show you, stuff's falling. I don't know if you can, I don't know how well this is, those 4 bullets at the top are the other 4 bullets out of the rifle that I got shot with.
Wow.
Well, he didn't need them anymore,
That's
you know,
cool.
you know. And then the these little pieces here are part of the fuse from a North Vietnamese 82 millimeter rocket or mortar round that I was up at Leghorn, and the round went off right behind me. I was on a rock ledge. It knocked me on my butt, ruptured my eardrums, but I didn't have a scratch on me. And then that bottom, that really big piece that goes all the way across the frame
Yeah.
is that's the shrapnel from a 122 millimeter rocket that
Whoa.
they hit our camp with in that attack in March of '69.
Well, I think
So
this is an excellent point that you brought this up, Terry, because I think for my viewers, high school students, or even, the thousands of other people that have watched our videos, it gives you a good idea of the size of shrapnel, and it varies. But I mean, that jagged, hot piece of metal flying around, that can do nasty work to the body.
that the temperature of that piece of shrapnel could have been, it could have been a couple of thousand degrees. I don't know. I mean, um, okay, these two pictures, these 2 pieces of shrapnel right here, we were getting, I don't know if I'll go as far as to say we were getting overrun, but we were in really heavy contact. And I had on that mission, I had this captain who, he was a lieutenant at the time. He liked to have me work the airstrikes because I got to say, I got pretty good at it. And I was working them in pretty close. So this one A1E, he had a load of 500-pound bombs. And I told him, I said, we're on the edge of a rock bluff and there's a bunch of them down below us. And if you could put the bomb down there, the shrapnel's gonna, when it blows up, besides taking them out, it's gonna hit the bluff and we'll be safe up on top. So we sent up some pin flares so he'd know where the edge of the bluff was. And he dropped his bombs, and those 2 pieces of shrapnel I pulled out of the ground right alongside of my thigh. I mean, so close I could feel the heat from them as they hit the ground. And I dug them out of the ground and kept them as souvenirs. And so that's where those came from.
Well, that's
So there's a story behind every one of them that it's not funny, but it's kind of unique. Like the bullets out of the gun I got shot with. How many guys have and I had the rifle too, but it disappeared while I was in the hospital. But how many guys have the bullets out of the gun they got shot with? It's just one of
absolutely.
those weird stories that you can tell.
Now, out of curiosity, Terry, and I wasn't perhaps expecting to go this route, but essentially you're operating as a ground forward air controller. So when you're calling in an airstrike, what do you need to do on the ground so the pilot knows angle, altitude, terrain, and what you're going up against?
First of all, your your Covey pilot, which is your forward air controller, he's communicating with the bombers or the planes or the gunships, whatever, on a different channel than what you're on talking to him. So the most important thing is he has got to know exactly where you're at. And I mean exactly where you're at because, there's this thing called danger close. And the pilots are trained to do everything they can to avoid a situation danger close. But if you're in danger of being overrun, the the bad guys learned very early on that there was a buffer area between you and the distance that they would drop bombs and or even fire the machine guns. So if they could get inside of that buffer zone, which was maybe 30, 35 yards generally, if they could get inside that, the only thing they'd have to worry about was us shooting at them. So and we had on our right shoulder, all the Americans carried a strobe light. Then we also, a lot of us carried these little pin flares, which is about the size of a fountain pen, and they'd fire these little miniature flares, I call them, and they would penetrate the triple canopy jungle and go up, and then the forward air controller could see, okay, I see along this line, this is your perimeter. Well, then he could fly around and he'd have a load of these 2.75-inch rockets with white phosphorus, and he would use those as marking rounds. So he could fire a rocket and then converse with the pilots and say, okay, from my round, drop your load 50 yards south or whatever direction from that, or whatever distance. And that's how the planes then would know where to drop their load. And it varied by the armament. Probably if they're firing the guns, the 7.62 miniguns, it was probably a lot easier to be more accurate with that. You drop a bomb, I mean, let's face it, you're flying in like whatever speed they're flying. And as you drop that bomb, it's going to have a distance to go in a forward motion before it hits the ground. So you're relying on that pilot's skill and experience in doing it to know exactly where that bomb is going to land. And you keep on the ground, you keep your fingers crossed. Because there were instances of casualties from, friendly fire. Napalm was probably the biggest one, where you really had to be careful, especially if it's getting danger close, because when the napalm explodes, it's spreading out into a wider area, so it had to be dropped further away from you. But man, if you got 500 troops in the open coming at you, either the miniguns, or because those 7.62 miniguns could put a bullet in every square foot of ground for a square mile. Wow. Or something like that. I mean, it was incredible.
That's insane.
And then of course napalm, you're gonna have barbecue all up and down the path of that napalm. And when the napalm goes off, it sucks all the oxygen out of the air. So you have to kind of learn to time it to where when the napalm goes off, you want to be holding your breath. Otherwise, it'll suck the air right out of your lungs.
Well, I was about to ask, if I'm not mistaken, quite a few of the NVA and Viet Cong, just throughout the war after napalm strikes, they weren't necessarily badly burned, but they suffocated to death because of the lack of oxygen.
That's right. Because if we had to hold our breath and it sucks the air out of our lungs, imagine, and it's not right on us. Imagine if it's right on them.
Right.
It's just, there is no oxygen. And, but if it's on them, they're gone, So yeah, I mean, but that's, and then at night with the strobe lights, it was, when I came back the last time, I was hanging out with a couple of my high school buddies, and one of them had been in the Air Force. And of course, I'm just back from Nam on 30-day leave, and it's all still so classified. But we're talking, okay, what'd you do over there? Well, he knew I was in Special Forces, but he didn't know really what I did. And what'd you do? And he says, well, I was a gunner on a spooky gunship. And he says, I would swear that I talked to you on the radio one time. And he said, there was a mission and it was somewhere where you weren't supposed to be, and you were in danger of being overrun, and you had, everybody had their strobe lights on. So it's on your shoulder, and the strobe light is in this nylon pouch.
So it
It
just
had a
sticks up for you.
snap. Yeah, it snapped shut at the top. Well, when you opened it up, it would direct the beam straight up instead of, going out. And again, those strobes were so bright. If you looked at one, it blinds you.
Yeah, like right here.
But okay, so yeah, it's over there. Yeah, on that right on my right shoulder. Um, so with everybody along the edge of the perimeter with their strobe lights on, they know exactly where our edge of our perimeter is. And he said, we were told to work the guns in danger close. So we did. And we talked a little more about this mission and everything. Well, it turned out I finally kind of spilled the beans because we'd have a few beers. And I kind of spilled the beans and I said, yes, that was me you were talking to. And he said, I could not believe that you were working us in as close as you were. And I said, well, we got a choice. You either work it in and take them out, or we get overrun, one or the other. So you do what you got to do. And he said, those strobe lights from 3,000 feet in the air, those strobe lights were just wonderful because in today's world, I think the guys have some kind of infrared tape or something on their helmets, and the pilots, they have to have some special equipment that lets them see it, so they don't have to carry a strobe light, which is great. It's one less piece of equipment to carry. But for us back in those days, we didn't wear helmets and we didn't wear flak jackets and all that nonsense. So we carried the strobe lights, and they were critical. I mean, at night, if you had to work any kind of airstrikes, or even if the forward air controller didn't know exactly where you were at, and you didn't want to fire a pin flare, you could turn a strobe on and he could see the strobe, and then he knows exactly where you're at. So if he does have to bring in aircraft, he still knows where you're at.
Well,
So
it's just brilliant, the technology and the uses of that for the time period. But I was going to bring this up just for sake of the conversation, because I'm curious. So let's say, in theory, right, that your team's dug in, or you're holding the perimeter along this little line here, correct? And
okay,
NVA are advancing from this direction, right?
yep.
So if you were guiding in air, and let's say it's not spooky, let's say it's a Sky Raider or a fast mover, would you tell the forward air controller to direct them from this position, or would you have them come parallel? That way no rounds fall possibly long into your position.
Parallel.
Okay.
Because and the number's it's just a number, but let's say there's a company of them, 100 and some, and they're
Right.
coming across down the hill from that tree line, and they're coming towards you. And like you said, we're in the middle right there, okay, in that little depression. So they're coming towards us. Well, so all those little blue arrows, let's say that's the bad guys. So if you go from left to right or right to left, whether they're firing their Gatling guns or they're dropping napalm or they're dropping bombs, you're going to take out more of them by going parallel to us and along the line of where they are than if you try to come in at them, like say from behind us at them. I mean, you can do that, but then you're limiting the line. You're limiting how much you're going to take out. So it always worked better to go parallel with us. Plus, there's less danger of what we call a short round or something. There's less danger of us getting hit by friendly fire.
Right. Excellent. That's awesome. And I figured as much, but I think it's relevant for people who have never even considered forward air control, how to work in, close air support, the importance of doing it correctly. Because, one wrong angle or one wrong direction, and while granted, sure, let's say that half this company's dead over here, but if a bomb falls short, you're going to have casualties too. Friendly fire.
Yeah, and there's instances where that happened. Now, if I was working those airstrikes, the first thing I would want to do is go parallel to us and try to take out the whole line. But the other thing I would want to do is back there at the tree line.
Yep.
Are there more of them back there waiting to come in? Who knows? I'd like to work some napalm or some gunships along that tree line just in case.
So something like this, and then of course hitting this tree line back here.
I would want right at the edge of the tree line from the field to the tree line. I'd want to hit that really heavy because in all probability, there's more of them back there. Plus, they've probably got machine guns and anti-aircraft guns. They're not going to put them out in the open, so they're going to put them inside the tree line. Well, they can't put them very far inside the tree line or they wouldn't be able to see what they're shooting at. So they're going to be right at the edge of that field. So if you hit them, you know, you've got a good chance of taking them out.
Outstanding. And
So
then
that's the way I learned on the job, and that's the way I would do it is parallel first and then move back and hit that tree line just in case. Because in all likelihood, if there's that many of them, there's going to be some anti-aircraft guns nearby.
right. And in the said theory, while you've got the air strikes and runs being directed here, the company in itself could start working back away from some of the fighting, call in more close strikes, and then get extracted, perhaps.
Yeah. Now, from that, this isn't a good picture because you see all the stakes in that.
Yep.
That's the outer perimeter outside of the walls of our camp. And so there's all kinds of wire, and you can't really see it well here, but there's all kinds of wire. But if we were out in the a real, like if we were on a real mission or something, I mean, I see several spots that would be good for an LZ. One's the upper left. There's a big clearing right there. Right there, where we just took out the bad guys would be a possibility. And then that big field up at the top. I would just be leery of that big field towards the top simply because if they were disciplined enough to hold their fire, they know there's going to be choppers coming in to try to get us out or gunships coming in, and that they want to take down that aircraft. So they might even hold their fire until aircraft came in and gave them a good target to take down. So I'd be leery about moving up to that field. So,
well, I think with that last conversation, I mean, it's a brilliant assessment of forward air control duties, but also insertions. I believe that people perhaps don't understand that when you're picking an LZ, landing zones, of course, that the more wide open terrain you have, the better chance you have of getting in there safely versus a smaller constricted one. Inve setting up an ambush, you can't see it, and as you expertly point out, they're going to target the birds.
that's right. And every piece of terrain is different yet similar. And so you have to be able to read the terrain. And then, I mean, generally you've got to make a split-second decision. And a lot of times you're relying on your forward air controller, and hopefully in his back seat he's got a covey rider, which would be one of our real experienced guys that had run recon and put his time in, and now he's riding in the back seat because he will have experienced a lot of that himself, and he's going to be able from a couple of thousand feet up read that same terrain and he'll be telling the forward air controller in the front seat, okay, let's line up on this axis or whatever. So it's not always the guy on the ground. It may be your covey rider that's calling the shots as far as, but you have to be able to tell them your situation, and they have to understand where you are. Because if they don't, and it happened a few times, friendly fire.
Well, I mean, with that, I mean, you can trace back those friendly fire forward air control duties all the way back to World War II, and it's unfortunate, but at the same time, it's the brilliance what we can do with technology. But at the same time, I also wanted to highlight to an extent too with the duties. Picking out an LZ, that's where the recon photographs also come into play heavily. Of you and your team leads being able to analyze the photograph in detail of this is an acceptable, LZ due to the size. This is a good tertiary, and the planning that goes into some of the missions that you were able to do.
See, and without the planning, you're nothing but chopped liver. So your team leader goes out, it might be a week before, it might be 2 days before, but the team leader would fly out with the forward air controller and fly over the area, take pictures, and on the map, identify generally a minimum of 3 potential LZs. So then when it comes time to the actual mission briefing, and see, this is where that mole down in Saigon came in. So you do your mission briefing and, okay, this is going to be our primary LZ. And you don't even talk about the other LZs. And you do that intentionally. So this will be our LZ. So all this guy in Saigon knows is they're going to land right here. So he then funnels that information to the Russians or the North Vietnamese, however he does it. And they then are going to be waiting on that LZ. Well, he's already decided, along with his forward air controller, we're really going to put him in on this LZ. And it may be a click or two away, and it could be a little bit further away from whatever their target is going to be on that mission, but they stand a better chance of succeeding because the bad guys are going to be waiting a mile over here and you're over here. And by the time they get to where you're at, if they figure it out, you're long gone. So, but all of that comes into the planning. And if you don't have plan B and plan C, I'm sorry, but your chances of making it are not nearly as good. So any good team leader is going to do that. They're going to, and of course, with the Hatchet Force going in 105 men, none of that much matters because they know where you're at anyway. You can't bring in that many choppers and put that many people on the ground without them knowing where you're at, because that many choppers. So you might have 10 or 12 choppers having to put half of you on the ground and then go back to Dock Toe, get the other half, and come back and put the other half in. So all told, you might be looking at 1.5 to 2 hours before everybody's on the ground. Well, that 1.5, 2 hours gets some bad guys time to move in. And plus they may have an LZ watcher sitting in a platform up in a tree, and he's calling and saying, well, they're all coming in over here. So these guys start moving towards you. And by the time the second lift gets to you, they're already there. So that's where all the advanced planning comes in. And towards, I'd say the middle of 69, it was so obvious that there was a leak somewhere that going in on a different LZ than what was officially stated was the norm for that reason. So,
Well, I mean, I think that that conversation is going to be excellent to pick up for our next interview. Because I do want to dive into this mole. I know you've mentioned it before. Some of the other SOG veterans have mentioned it to an extent, but I mean, one of the questions that I think would ponder anyone is how could one of the world's arguably most advanced special forces teams, one of the most elite, have an operative that gets in via from the enemy side?
Oh, that's easy. The whole the whole concept was, the term they used back then was Vietnamization. The whole idea was to start training the Vietnamese to take over and fight the war themselves. You know, where we would pull out. Well, we see how that ended up anyway, but nevertheless, that was the idea. Was so in Saigon, it was a supposed to be a joint thing between the U.S. and Vietnamese military working together. Well, this guy, the mole, which we didn't learn all this until years after the war was over. But this guy was actually a North Vietnamese colonel. He was a colonel in the North Vietnamese army, and he had infiltrated the South Vietnamese army, and he probably had some help from other people. And so he was assigned at SOG headquarters, and he was on the Vietnamese contingent working with the Americans, planning all these missions. So he was right there. And then he'd go back to his hotel room or whatever at night. And from what we learned, he apparently had a radio, and he would then notify whoever he notified, the Russians or whoever, and give them all the information. Plus, again, this was learned years later. The most people have, well, I don't know most, but the John Walker spy ring. Walker was in a position where he was getting all the messages from Saigon being sent back to the Joint Chiefs, given all that information, the coordinates of the LZ, the size of the team, the names of the American team members, their code names, all that stuff was being sent back. And he was intercepting it and funneling it to the Russians, who would then funnel it to the North Vietnamese. So that's why it seemed like they were always waiting on us. And so that's why we started going in on alternate LZs, because we lost a lot of guys before we finally figured it out that there's no other answer other than there's a mole. It just didn't make sense. So, but sometime after the war, somebody came across a picture of this guy who was the mole, and they came across a picture of him. I think he was receiving some kind of medal from the North Vietnamese army for what he did, but they were never able to catch him during the war, so he made it out alive. But we lost a lot of guys because of him.
Yeah.
A lot of choppers, a lot of planes, and so, but that's what spies do, I mean, I guess you can't fault them, because they were doing what we would have done in the same situation,
Absolutely.
I mean, it only made sense.
And clearly this one was pretty damn good at his job. And I mean, but at the same time, SOG teams were too, especially any of the SOG operatives as well. And I think that's what I've enjoyed the most out of getting to know you in our interviews is just your personal experience. And so with that, because I've unfortunately got to run here, but I hope we can do this next weekend. I'll send you some times whenever works for you.
Hang on. There's next weekend. I think there's a problem. I know there's a problem on one day. Let's see. So that would be the 9th and the 10th.
Yes, sir.
The 9th is open, but the 10th is out.
Let's see. The 9th.
So next Saturday would be open.
Well, I can do next Saturday.
Okay. I got one other little thing to show you because we talked about that in the previous thing. This is the copy. This is the letter from the president when I got the award for working with the wounded soldiers.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I don't know how well it, because on my screen, it's not showing completely, but
still though, I mean that's freaking cool though. That's something to be proud of. That's awesome, Terry.
But anyway, so those hang on the walls out in my workshop. But